My wife dismissed me in front of hundreds of witnesses, not as an employee, but as a person. Every word was designed to make the room understand who held the power. She pulled that badge slowly, like she was making a point. What no one there understood was that the man she had just discarded was not who he appeared to be. The calm way I set my locker key down and walked out was not defeat. It was a decision. And the only question was how long it would take her to realize what she had just done. If you're new here, this channel is where real stories live. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The parking lot was quiet when I walked out. No one followed me. No one called after me. I crossed the asphalt in the same clothes I had worn to every shift for the past 12 years, my hands in my pockets, and I did not look back at the building until I reached my car. Then I did look back. I stood there for a long moment looking at the name carved into the stone above the entrance. Delaney Memorial. My father's name. My name. A name I had never once used to make a single person inside that building treat me differently. My father, Desmond Bellamy, built that hospital in the early 1980s with money he had spent 2 decades accumulating, and a belief that the east side of this city deserved something better than a county clinic with broken chairs in the waiting room. He was not a flashy man. He wore the same 3 suits in rotation and drove a Buick until it stopped starting. But he understood that a hospital is not a building, it is a promise. When he died, he left the hospital inside a structure so carefully arranged that no single person could dismantle it quickly. Vantage Health Holdings held the physical assets. Bellamy Patient Trust held Vantage. And I held the trust not as a symbol, but as the only person with voting authority over any decision that affected the hospital's future. He made one condition. I had to learn the hospital from the inside before I ever touched the governance structure. Not from a conference room. From the floors. From the rooms where people were afraid, where families sat in plastic chairs and waited to hear whether someone they loved was going to be all right. I honored that condition not because he demanded it, but because once I started, I could not imagine doing it any other way. I had been a nurse for 12 years. I became good at it, the way you become good at anything that matters by failing at it first, by learning from people who were better than you, by staying in the room when every instinct told you to step out. I ran the ICU as charge nurse and served on the patient safety committee, and most of my colleagues saw me as someone who stayed a little too long after his shift and cared a little too much about protocol. That was fine with me. I was not there to be interesting. I was there because the work was real. Amara came into my life at a department orientation 10 years ago. She was sharp-focused, the kind of person who asked the only question in a 2-hour meeting that was actually worth asking. We had coffee that evening and did not run out of things to say for 3 hours. I supported her through her graduate program in healthcare administration, took on extra shifts when she was in class, and stayed home with our daughter Elise when Amara traveled for conferences. She worked harder than almost anyone I had seen climb through that organization, and the positions she earned, department manager, then director of operations, then acting chief executive, she earned through competence and persistence. I never used my position to help her get a single promotion. Her success had to be hers. But somewhere in the process of becoming the most powerful person in that building, Amara stopped seeing me the way she used to. She began introducing me to investors as her husband, who worked at the hospital, omitting the word nurse the way you omit a detail you are not sure how to explain. Her mother, Lenora, grew more openly dismissive, telling Amara once, within earshot of me, that she had outgrown her circumstances. Then Julian Keaton arrived, brought in to manage a major expansion deal involving the sale of the East Wing Community Care Facility, the elimination of several hundred nursing positions, and the outsourcing of essential services to private vendors. In exchange, Amara would be formally appointed permanent chief executive. It was the kind of deal that looks good on a spreadsheet and costs real people real things. I also saw what Julian meant to Amara. The late meetings that ran past midnight, the dinners logged as working sessions, The way his name appeared in her sentences more and more offered as evidence that someone finally understood her at the level she deserved. What I am certain of is that by the time I discovered the falsified safety report, my concerns about the hospital and my concerns about my marriage had become the same concern. The report was one I knew well. I had contributed data to it. The original documented clearly that the proposed staffing cuts would increase patient risk in measurable ways. The version submitted to the board said the opposite, and my electronic signature had been attached to the final document as though I had reviewed and approved it. I went to Amara's office, closed the door, and told her what I had found. I asked her to pause the deal until we could establish what had happened. I spoke to her directly without theater, because I had believed for a decade that she would do the same for me. She told me I was jealous. She said I was manufacturing a crisis to pull her back down to my level. She said it calmly, which was almost worse than if she had been angry. The following morning, when I stood up in the staff meeting and began to raise the question about the safety report, Amara executed a plan. She announced to the room that I had violated internal protocol, disclosed confidential materials, and acted in deliberate opposition to hospital leadership. Then she walked down from the stage and removed my badge from my chest slowly, deliberately, and told me I was fired. I set my locker key on the table. I looked at the nurses I had trained, the physicians I had worked beside, the staff members I had defended in committee meetings. They looked at the floor. Every one of them. Not because they believed what Amara had said, but because they understood that disagreement had a price. I walked out without another word. I sat in my car in the parking lot before I called Everett Cole, the attorney who had managed the Bellamy Patient Trust since my father's death. I told him what had happened. When I finished, he confirmed what I already knew: the trust held 72% of voting authority in Vantage. I could halt the transaction, reconstitute the board, and remove Amara from her position before the end of the business day. Part of me wanted exactly that. But I kept coming back to the falsified report. Someone had deliberately replaced my original assessment with language that cleared the deal, and that kind of change does not happen in isolation. If I revealed my ownership now, before I understood the full scope of what had been altered, Julian and Amara would have enough warning to restructure the evidence and turn the entire thing into a story about a bitter husband using inherited wealth to punish a more successful wife. I told Everett I was not ready to act publicly. I asked him instead to open a confidential audit every contract connected to the expansion deal, every vendor relationship, every revision logged in the safety reporting system over the past 6 months. Everett said he would begin immediately. I put the phone down and sat with the building still visible through the windshield. My father's name still cut into the stone above the door, and I made my decision. Not to win the moment. To protect what the moment was actually about. The internal memo went out before I reached home that afternoon. Amara sent it to every department, a formal notice stating that I had been terminated for unprofessional conduct and deliberate disclosure of confidential materials. My access credentials were deactivated. My name was removed from the continuing education listings, where I had been listed as a contributing instructor for 4 years. Julian used media contacts to plant the suggestion that a disgruntled employee was attempting to derail a beneficial deal. Amara told the board I was experiencing a psychological crisis brought on by my inability to accept her professional success. She used language that frames everything the accused says as further evidence of the condition being described. Most of my colleagues stayed quiet. I understood why. Then Claire reached out. She was a night shift nurse in the ICU Sharp. Careful, the kind of person who documented everything, because she understood that in a hospital, details save lives. She contacted me through a personal email address, not her work account. She told me the ICU had been quietly understaffed since the morning after my termination, and that several incident reports from recent weeks had been altered before reaching the department director, adjusted in small ways that changed their severity classification. I told her not to take anything. No photographs, no copied files. I asked her only to keep a personal record, dates, times, names of staff present, and any patient situations she believed had been directly affected by the staffing changes. She agreed and said she had taken the job to take care of patients, not to watch paperwork get rearranged to protect a business deal. At home, Amara had the locks changed while I was out one afternoon. The joint accounts were frozen, and Elise, our daughter, who was 11 years old and had no framework for what was happening between her parents, had been told by her mother that I had caused trouble at work and needed to leave for a while. I arranged to meet Elise at a small park near the house. She sat on a bench with her hands folded in her lap and did not look at me when I sat beside her. After a moment, she asked if I had really done something wrong at the hospital. I did not defend myself. Instead, I asked her if she remembered the night she broke her arm in 3rd grade, the way I had stayed in the hospital room with her until almost 4 in the morning, because I did not want her to wake up in an unfamiliar place and find herself alone. She said she remembered. I told her I had not stayed that night because it was my job. I stayed because she was my daughter. She said nothing after that. When it was time to go, she reached over and took my hand for just a second so briefly I almost thought I had imagined it, and then she stood up and walked toward the park entrance without looking back. I watched her until she was gone. That moment came closer to breaking me than anything Amara had done in that auditorium. But it was also the moment that made the rest of it simple. Not easy. Simple. I knew what I was doing this for. Everett's audit found what it needed to find. 3 consulting firms had received significant payments routed through the hospital's operational budget. All 3 established within the past 14 months. All 3 connected through filings and shared addresses to entities Julian had previously been associated with. The deal included a back-end arrangement directing a portion of the transaction value into a private investment vehicle. Julian was a named beneficiary. So was Amara. The document that stopped me entirely was the authorization letter bearing the official seal of Vantage Health Holdings and the electronic signature of the trust's authorized representative, my signature. I had never seen the document. I had never signed it. Someone had accessed the signature credentials and manufactured my approval of a deal I had explicitly tried to stop. This was no longer about a falsified safety report. This was a coordinated effort to take assets that did not belong to them, using my name to make it appear legal. A few days after Everett shared his findings, Julian requested a meeting at a small coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital, far enough from the building that it would not appear on any facility security logs. He was already seated when I arrived, a thick envelope on the table between us. He told me he was going to be straightforward. He said I was a skilled nurse and that no one was questioning my record. But I was standing in the way of a transaction that had taken months to structure, and the people involved had more resources than I did. The envelope contained a separation agreement, a release of all claims against the hospital signed in exchange for severance, the preservation of my professional reputation, and continued access to Elise under a mutually agreed schedule. He framed the last point as generosity. I did not open the envelope. I asked one question: what would happen to the East Wing Community Care Facility after the deal closed? He said it would be shut down, not generating sufficient return. I asked how many patients were currently receiving ongoing treatment there. He said that was no longer my area of concern. I nodded slowly, the way you nod when someone has confirmed something you needed to hear said out loud. I stood up, left the envelope on the table, and walked to the door. I reached into my jacket pocket and stopped the recording on my phone. Julian had come to that meeting believing he was managing a problem. What he had actually done was hand me the clearest evidence of his intentions in his own voice, entirely unprompted. Within the week, Amara filed for divorce and petitioned for temporary sole custody of Elise. The filing described me as emotionally volatile and financially unstable. She submitted the edited video from the staff meeting as supporting documentation, the version that showed me standing up and being escorted out without the context of what I had been trying to say. A restraining order was also filed, restricting my access to hospital property. Everett immediately filed an emergency motion in a separate court, requesting a temporary stay of the restraining order on the grounds that my presence at the upcoming Vantage ownership verification, a procedure written into the original trust charter, and legally mandatory before any major transaction constituted a protected governance obligation that superseded the access restriction. The motion was narrow, specific, and supported by 40 years of trust documentation. The court granted a limited stay the following afternoon, applicable solely to my attendance at the annual governance meeting. It did not dissolve the restraining order. It created a precise, time-limited legal window, and that window was all I needed. Then Claire went silent. She sent me 3 words I can't anymore. Amara had called her into the executive office and informed her that she faced termination, the revocation of her professional references, and a potential legal claim for patient privacy violations if she continued any contact with me. I sent Claire 1 message back and told her she owed me nothing and to keep herself safe. But her absence left a gap. Shortly after, Julian ordered a wipe of the internal server logs, a standard IT maintenance action that looked routine from the outside and destroyed the most direct evidence of who had altered the safety reports and when. The audit still had the financial records, but the chain of evidence connecting Julian directly to the falsified documents was broken, and the deal was set to close at the annual Vantage Gala in less than 48 hours. Then Everett called back with something I had forgotten. My father had written a provision into the trust's operational requirements in the hospital's early years. Every patient safety report above a certain severity threshold was required to be automatically transmitted to an external archive maintained by the trust, not stored on the hospital's server, but transmitted out before any internal changes could be made. Amara and Julian could wipe the hospital's system. They could not reach what had already left it. Everett found the original reports, the metadata showing exactly when the internal version had been altered, and the account credentials used to make the change. Everything. I had less than 2 days to use it. The Vantage annual gala was held in the hospital's main reception hall, dressed that evening with catering tables and directed lighting and the particular atmosphere of people who believe they are about to celebrate something. Board members, department heads, investors, representative staff. The event was also being streamed live to every department in the building, which meant that whatever happened in that room would be witnessed by the entire hospital simultaneously. Everett and I waited in the corridor outside until the program began. He had the trust documents in a leather portfolio, the original safety reports, the metadata logs, the financial audit trail, the authorization letter bearing my forged signature alongside records showing I had never accessed the system on the date it was supposedly signed. 40 years of careful legal architecture built by my father to protect something he believed in, and it had held even against people who thought they had found every gap. The limited court stay Everett had secured meant I could walk through those doors for the duration of the governance meeting without violating the restraining order. 1 window, 1 chance. Through the doors, I could hear Amara's voice carrying across the hall. She was telling the room that leadership required courage, that real executives made hard decisions and did not flinch when those decisions were unpopular. She used my termination as her example, framing it as evidence of the clarity and resolve the moment demanded. The room responded warmly. She had always been good at rooms. Then she announced that Vantage Health Holdings had authorized the transaction and that she was prepared to sign the agreement that evening. That was when Everett opened the door and walked in. I followed him. The room noticed us before anyone spoke. That particular silence, the kind where 100 people stop at once, has a texture to it. Amara looked up from the podium, and her expression moved through several things in rapid succession before settling into something controlled and hard. She told security to remove me, that I was in violation of a restraining order. The board chair, Gerald Holt, raised his hand and asked security to hold. He had received Everett's documentation the previous day, confirming that the court had granted a limited stay, specifically authorizing my presence at this governance verification. The ownership confirmation procedure was written into the original trust charter. It could not be waived and could not proceed without me. Gerald read from the trust documentation. He confirmed that Bellamy Patient Trust held 72% of voting authority in Vantage Health Holdings, and that the trust's sole authorized representative, the individual with exclusive control over all major transactions, was present in the room. Then he read the name. Cedric Bellamy. The hall went so quiet, I could hear the ventilation system running overhead. Julian, standing to the right of the stage, had gone very still, in the way people go still when they are rapidly recalculating. I walked to the front of the room in a plain, dark suit, not the kind that announces itself, and stood where I had a clear view of the people who had watched Amara remove my badge 10 days earlier. I told the room that the transaction Amara had described as authorized had never received my approval. The authorization document bearing my signature was a forgery, and we had documentation establishing the exact account credentials used to create it, the timestamp of the alteration, and the financial structure that explained why the forgery had been necessary. Everett laid the portfolio on the table in front of the board and began distributing the supporting documents. Amara told the room I was lying. Her voice was steady. I had always respected how steady she could keep her voice. Julian did not match her steadiness. He looked at the documents in front of the board members, ran whatever calculation he needed to run, and told Gerald Holt that he had relied on representations made by hospital leadership regarding the authorization process and had not been informed of any irregularities. He was prepared to cooperate fully with any review. He took one step away from where Amara was standing. It was a small movement, but everyone in that room saw it, including her. Gerald called for an immediate suspension of the transaction and asked both Amara and Julian to surrender their access credentials pending a governance review. 2 members of the security team came forward. One of them approached Amara with a request for her executive access card. She looked at him for a long moment, then reached up and unclipped the chief executive badge from her jacket and placed it in his hand. She did not look at me when she did it. I did not look away from her not to make it harder, but because I was not ashamed of what had happened in that room, and I was not going to act as though I were. The board voted that evening to void the transaction in its entirety and refer the financial documentation to external investigators. The restraining order was addressed the following morning when the coffee shop recording was submitted to the court. In that recording, Julian confirmed without any prompting that the East Wing would be closed after the deal closed, and that Elise's custody situation could be structured in ways that made continued conflict costly for me, using my daughter's access to her father as a variable in a business negotiation. The court found the recording material to the motion. The restraining order was vacated before noon. The custody petition collapsed alongside it. The description of me as financially unstable and emotionally volatile could not survive contact with the reality of who I was and what I had been doing. I did not ask the court to restrict Amara's access to Elise. Whatever she had done to me, she was still Elise's mother. What I did ask for was a clear order prohibiting either parent from involving Elise in communications about the legal proceedings, and the court granted it. Before the week was out, I met with the board's interim administrator and made several things part of the governance record. Every action taken against Claire, the threatened termination, the withdrawal of professional references, the implied legal exposure, was formally rescinded. Her position was restored in full. Beyond that, I asked that she be appointed to the newly constituted Patient Safety Committee as a frontline staff representative, a role the committee had never previously included. When I told her in person, she had the look of someone who had been preparing for bad news so long that good news required a moment to register. I told her she had not done anything wrong, that she had tried to protect patients inside a system that was working against her, and that the system was different now. She said she would take the appointment. She was the first person to stand and applaud when I walked back through the hospital doors the following Monday morning. The East Wing Community Care Facility was not sold. I formalized its continuation under a restructured budget and established it as the Desmond Bellamy Community Care Center, with services covering emergency care, maternal health, mental health support, and treatment access for families who could not afford private rates. It was what my father had originally built it to be before institutional drift had slowly reclassified it from a mission into a liability. I did not appoint myself chief executive. The role required someone whose full attention could be on the administrative structure, and mine had always been somewhere else. I sat on the selection committee alongside a physician, 2 nurses, and a patient advocate. The first criterion I asked the committee to consider was whether the candidates had ever worked directly with patients in a clinical setting. Not as a requirement, as a factor. It mattered that whoever sat in that office had at some point understood what was actually at stake in the decisions they were making. Lenora came to find me the week after everything concluded. She sat across from me in a small conference room and told me she had misjudged me based on the uniform I wore, and the salary she assumed came with it. I told her she was not wrong for not knowing I owned the hospital. Very few people did, and I had worked deliberately to keep it that way. But the thing she had been wrong about was something she had known regardless, that the work I did mattered, and that the people who did it deserved to be treated accordingly. A title on a door did not change that. She did not have a response, and I did not wait for one. In the main corridor of the hospital, I arranged to have a photograph hung near the entrance. A black and white image from the early years, my father in plain work clothes, standing with the first nursing staff, all of them looking at the camera with the expressions of people who had just done something they were proud of. Beneath it, a single line in simple block letters: "Power is not measured by how many people stand down for you, but by how many people you can protect when they cannot protect themselves." The court set a custody schedule several weeks later. The first weekend it took effect, I picked Elise up on a Saturday afternoon, and we went to the same park where she had once asked me if I had done something wrong. We sat on the same bench. The trees were further along than they had been that first afternoon. The season had moved while everything else was moving, and the light came through them differently. Elise looked at me directly this time. She asked why I had stayed quiet on the day I was fired, when one sentence could have stopped everything. I told her that one sentence would have ended the problem in that room on that morning, but it would have given the people who had been falsifying documents enough warning to destroy what they had left behind. And if that evidence disappeared, the patients in the East Wing would have lost their facility. The nurses on the cut list would have lost their jobs, and no one would have been able to hold anyone responsible. I had chosen to stay silent not because I was weak, but because I needed enough time to make sure none of those people could be harmed again. Elise was quiet for a moment, looking out at the park. Then she leaned her head against my shoulder the way she used to when she was much younger, and she stayed like that for a while. She did not need more explanation. She needed to know that her father had not been absent when she thought he was, that the silence she had witnessed had been a form of presence, not its absence. I had lost the marriage I had believed in for 10 years. I had watched the person I loved and supported and trusted use everything I had given her as material for a case against me. That was not something I would finish grieving quickly, and I did not pretend otherwise. But sitting in that park with my daughter's head on my shoulder, I understood what my father had understood when he stood in front of an empty lot on the east side of this city and decided it was worth building something there. The things worth protecting are never the things that belong to you. They are the things you are responsible for. The patients who walk through those doors trusting that someone on the other side genuinely cares. The nurses who show up to every shift and do the work without recognition or reward. The daughter who reaches for your hand in a moment of uncertainty and finds it there. Those are the things you build toward. Those are the things you choose silence for when silence is the only way to keep them safe. And that, I think, is the only kind of power worth having. If this story stayed with you, the kind that reminds you that quiet people sometimes carry the most, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one, and every single one of them is worth your time.